Hello everyone and welcome back to Terrifying Bedtime Tales. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Lena had always been drawn to the eerie, forgotten radio station deep in the woods, the one that everyone in town swore was abandoned. But when she found the dusty old transmitter in a decrepit cabin one stormy night, she thought it might be the perfect way to escape her mundane life. Little did she know, the moment she turned the dial, the voices began. First, it was just whispers, faint and unclear, like someone else was tuning into her frequency. But then the voices grew louder, more insistent. They spoke her name, told her stories of things that had happened in the forest long before she arrived. They whispered of a place hidden beneath the trees, a place that shouldn't exist. And they warned her, the signal is alive. Now no matter where she goes, Lena can hear them. Those same voices, telling her things she shouldn't know, pulling her closer to the heart of the forest. The radio hasn't stopped, and neither have they. It was a crisp autumn evening when a group of friends, Lena, Jack, Evan, and Sarah, decided to take a camping trip out in the woods, far from the distractions of the city. The woods were vast, stretching for miles with no cell service, making it the perfect retreat for those seeking solitude. They had been planning the trip for months, eager to escape the monotony of everyday life. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear, they set up camp by a small, babbling creek. The air was cool but not cold, and the sound of the water provided a soothing background to their conversation and laughter. They ate s'mores, shared stories, and sang along to music from an old portable radio. After a few hours, the fire dwindled down to embers, and one by one, they began to retreat to their tents. The woods were eerily quiet now, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Inside her tent, Lena lay on her back, staring up at the canopy of trees above. Jack had fallen asleep beside her, snoring lightly. Suddenly, she heard a strange noise, like a faint buzzing coming from the radio they had left outside. She glanced at Jack to see if he was awake, but he was still asleep. Curiosity piqued. She unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The air had grown colder, and the fire had burned down to a faint glow. The radio sat on the ground near the fire pit, its antenna crooked, and its dial set to a low frequency. The buzzing sound was still coming from it. Lena bent down to adjust the dial, hoping to clear the static. As she did, the radio flickered and then crackled to life. A low voice, distorted and hollow, filled the air. "Tonight they will come for you," the voice said. Lena froze, her blood running cold. She pulled her hand away from the radio as if it had burned her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the device, now silent again except for the faint static. What the hell was that? Her fingers trembled as she picked it up and turned the dial again, but the station wouldn't change. She looked around, expecting to see someone nearby, someone playing a prank, but the campsite was empty. Jack was still snoring in the tent, oblivious to the strange occurrence. Then, the voice came again. "Don't worry, Lena. We know where you are." This time, the voice was clearer, more deliberate. It was as though it was speaking directly to her. Her skin prickled with terror. She quickly switched off the radio and rushed back into the tent, heart racing. She shook Jack awake. "Jack," she hissed, "wake up. Something's wrong." Jack groaned and rubbed his eyes, clearly annoyed. "Lena, it's the middle of the night. What's going on?" Lena's voice trembled. "I heard something, a voice on the radio. It knew my name." Jack blinked at her, clearly not understanding. "You're serious?" "Yes," she insisted. "It said, 'Don't worry, Lena. We know where you are.'" Jack sat up, still groggy, but now paying attention. "Maybe it's just a weird station, or some prank radio station. You know how strange these old radios can get." Lena shook her head. "No, it was too real. It wasn't just static. It was like someone was speaking to me." Jack sighed and leaned back. Alright, let's check it out. But if we find some weird broadcast, I'm turning it off. And we're going back to sleep. Reluctantly, Lena followed Jack back outside. The radio sat where she'd left it, silent now, but she could still feel the unease crawling up her spine. Jack crouched down and turned the dial. The static filled the air again, crackling loudly before the voice emerged. "This is the beginning," it said, its tone ominous. "You've entered our domain now." Lena's eyes widened. She backed away from the radio, panic rising in her chest. "Jack, this isn't just some random station. We need to get out of here." But before Jack could respond, the voice spoke again, and this time, it sounded almost as though it was coming from behind them. "You can't leave, Lena. You can't leave because you've already made the choice." The voice seemed to shift, blending with the static, and a strange humming sound filled the air. Lena spun around, but the campsite was empty. The woods were completely still, no animals, no wind, just silence. She turned back to the radio, but Jack was now staring at it with wide eyes, his face pale. "Lena, this isn't right. This radio, it's not just some broadcast. It's like it's alive." Lena's heart hammered in her chest. "What do you mean alive?" Before Jack could answer, the radio emitted a high-pitched screech, and the voice came again, this time louder, more distorted. "They've already started. You can't escape now." Lena's breath hitched. "Who are they? What do you mean?" The voice seemed to laugh, but it wasn't a human laugh. It was mechanical, echoing through the night like a distorted, hollow sound. "They will find you. They will take you one by one." Lena reached down to grab the radio, her hands shaking. She yanked the power cord from the device, but the voice continued, unaffected. "You can't silence us," it said. "We are everywhere." The woods around them seemed to pulse, like the very ground beneath their feet was alive. A low, vibrating hum filled the air, and Lena's teeth began to ache as if the sound was resonating deep inside her body. "Jack, we need to go," she screamed, but Jack was no longer looking at her. He was staring off into the distance, his eyes unfocused, his face pale. "Jack?" Lena shook him, but he didn't respond. His body felt stiff, his skin cold. And then she saw it. In the darkness, beyond the campsite, a shadow moved. It was tall, shifting, like a figure out of a nightmare. The shadows seemed to twist around it, as if it were bending the very air. Lena's pulse raced. She turned back to Jack, shaking him harder. "Wake up. We need to go. Now." But his body remained unresponsive. The figure in the distance moved closer, its shape becoming clearer. It was humanoid but distorted, its limbs elongated unnaturally, its face a featureless mask. The radio beside her crackled again, its voice now a chorus of distorted, jumbled words, all repeating one message. "They are coming." Lena's legs felt like they were made of stone, her body frozen in terror. The figure advanced, its shadow stretching across the camp. Suddenly, the radio screamed one last time, its voice an ear-splitting cacophony of static and words. Then everything went silent. For a long moment, Lena stood paralyzed, staring at the figure in the darkness. It was almost upon her. Then, in the blink of an eye, the figure disappeared, vanishing into thin air. The humming stopped. The woods fell back into eerie silence. Lena collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. She was trembling, covered in cold sweat, her mind racing. "Jack," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Jack, please wake up." He didn't respond. Her eyes flicked to the radio, which was now completely silent, as if nothing had ever happened. But the fear in Lena's heart refused to fade. Whatever that broadcast was, whatever those voices were, they weren't gone. And as she looked up, the figure was there again, standing just beyond the tree line, watching, waiting. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the shadowy figure. It was standing just beyond the trees, its form faintly visible in the pale moonlight. It didn't move, not even a twitch of a limb. It was like it was frozen, waiting for something. But Lena knew that it wasn't waiting for her to make the first move. It was simply watching. Her hands were shaking, and her mind screamed at her to run. But something in her gut told her that running would only make it worse, that this thing was not just a figment of her imagination. This was real, and it was here. The radio beside her suddenly crackled back to life, its distorted voice sending a fresh wave of terror through her. "You thought you could leave," the voice rasped, "but you can never leave once you've heard us. You are ours now." Lena turned her eyes back to Jack, still lying unconscious beside her. He looked as though he were asleep, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. But there was something wrong in his stillness, like he wasn't truly there, like he had become part of the dream. She crawled over to him, ignoring the weight of dread pulling her limbs down. She grabbed his shoulders, shaking him harder. "Jack, wake up. Please wake up." His eyes fluttered open, but they were vacant, blank. For a moment, Lena thought he might just be disoriented, but then he whispered, his voice hollow and far away, "Lena, it's too late." The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She knew instantly that wasn't Jack speaking. Before she could respond, the figure in the woods moved again. This time, it didn't hesitate. It took a step forward, its long, grotesque limbs bending at unnatural angles, as if the bones inside were too brittle to support its weight. The shadows it cast stretched unnervingly across the campsite. It moved with a fluidity that suggested it wasn't bound by the same rules as living things. "Jack, please," Lena screamed, but he didn't react. His face remained locked in that blank, empty expression. The figure came closer, and Lena knew she had moments, maybe less, before it was upon them. She had to do something. Anything. She grabbed the radio once more, this time clutching it to her chest like a lifeline, as if the device might somehow provide answers or a way out. The voice crackled through the static, more insistent than before. "You can't escape. You can't hide. We are all around you." Lena's hands trembled as she turned the dial frantically. She had to change the station, had to break the frequency somehow. Maybe if she disrupted the signal, she could stop whatever was happening. But nothing worked. The voice persisted. "Your fear calls us. We are inside the static. We are part of it now." With a strangled sob, Lena threw the radio into the fire. It landed with a hiss, crackling and sparking, but the voice didn't stop. It only grew louder. "Run, Lena." It wasn't the radio anymore. The voice was in her head. She could hear it clearly, like a deep whisper, like it was all around her. "Run now." Lena didn't hesitate. She yanked Jack up, pulling him to his feet even as his body felt stiff and unyielding. She could hear the footsteps of the figure, those long, unnatural strides, coming closer and closer. It was like the world was moving in slow motion, every second stretched to an unbearable length. With Jack half dragged, half carried, Lena stumbled toward the tree line. She could hear the voice again, louder now, like it was echoing in her skull. "You think you can escape the signal?" it jeered. "You think you can run from us? We are always watching." Lena pushed forward, her legs screaming in protest. She couldn't look back. She couldn't afford to look back. But the weight of the presence behind her was suffocating, a tangible force in the air. "Why won't you leave us alone?" she sobbed, barely able to catch her breath as she dragged Jack through the dense undergrowth. "You never had a choice, Lena," the voice said, sounding closer now. "You've already made your deal, and now we're here to collect." A bone-chilling wind swept through the trees, snapping twigs and sending leaves spiraling into the air. The trees around her seemed to close in, forming a labyrinth, trapping her. She glanced around, frantic. She could no longer hear the crackling of the fire or the distant sounds of the creek. The woods had become deathly silent, save for the thudding of her own heartbeat. Then, a screeching noise shattered the silence. It was the radio, still alive despite being consumed by the flames. Lena turned to see it, still crackling in the fire, but this time it was different. It wasn't static anymore. The radio was now glowing faintly, its light twisting, bending, like it was a portal into something far darker. The voice came again, its tone no longer distorted. "You should have listened, Lena." A feeling of vertigo hit her. The world around her seemed to tilt, the trees warping in unnatural ways. It was as if the ground beneath her feet was shifting, bending to the will of the entity speaking through the radio. Jack, still unresponsive, suddenly went limp in her arms. Lena screamed, trying desperately to hold him up, but his body felt weightless now, as though it were turning to dust. She turned his face toward her, but his eyes, empty, dark pools, stared back at her. They were no longer Jack's eyes. They were the eyes of something else. "Jack." Lena whimpered, panic clawing at her throat, but Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. He was already lost. The radio continued to hum, and the air grew thick with the presence of something far worse than she could comprehend. She stumbled back, eyes wide with horror as the trees around her began to twist and warp, their trunks stretching, bending into shapes that were both human and monstrous, as though the forest itself was alive, a living entity feeding on her fear. "You belong to us now," the voice repeated, cold and unwavering. "You cannot escape what has already been written." Lena felt the air growing heavier around her, the shadows growing long and dark, pulling her in, consuming her. Her heart raced. She wanted to scream, to beg to run, but the words caught in her throat. The woods were swallowing her whole, pulling her into something that didn't belong to this world. She turned, desperate, and saw the figure once again standing in the distance. It was closer now, no longer hidden behind the trees. It was tall and grotesque, with elongated limbs that twisted in impossible angles, its face a mass of shifting shadows. It reached out toward her, its fingers long and spindly, curling in the air like tendrils. In that moment, Lena realized it wasn't just one figure. It was countless, all of them rising from the earth, emerging from the shadows, their forms writhing in the air like specters. They were the voices. They were the ones who had been whispering to her, the ones she had heard on the radio. And they weren't just watching. They were here to take her, her vision blurred, her mind spinning as she fell to her knees. But there was no escape. The last thing she heard was the voice, ringing in her head like a death knell. "We are always watching, Lena. Always." Lena's heart pounded in her chest like a drum, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps. She wasn't sure what was worse, the entity looming in front of her, or the knowledge that she had no idea how to escape it. It was as if she had stepped into a nightmare from which there was no waking. The trees around her seemed to shift and breathe, their branches twisting toward her like long, skeletal fingers. The air was thick with a tension she couldn't explain, like the very atmosphere was charged with malice, pressing down on her, forcing her to stay. They were closing in. She could feel them everywhere, all around her. The radio, the cursed infernal radio, sat abandoned on the forest floor, still crackling with static. The faint glow it emitted pulsed in time with her heartbeat. She had to destroy it. She had to end it. She couldn't let this thing control her mind any longer. Lena tried to push herself to her feet, but her legs felt like jelly. The woods were spinning around her, dizzying and nightmarish. She looked down at Jack's body, still limp in her arms, his once lively features now twisted and vacant. He was gone. He was already lost to whatever these things were, whatever this force was. Tears blurred her vision, and she felt a wave of helplessness threaten to drown her. She couldn't think straight. The voices, their whispers, were all around her now, rising and falling like an ominous chorus. "You can't run, Lena," they whispered, like 1,000 voices speaking as one. "You belong to us now." She gritted her teeth, her hands trembling as she forced herself to move forward. She staggered toward the radio, dragging Jack's lifeless body along. Her steps felt like they were taking her deeper into a nightmare, each movement a struggle against an unseen force, pulling her back, anchoring her in place. The closer she got to the radio, the more intense the sensation became. Her head throbbed, her ears buzzing with the distorted static. The voice, now omnipresent, echoed inside her mind, its cold tone filling the air. "They are already here, Lena. There is no escape." She reached the radio and yanked it out of the dirt with all her strength. It felt as if something fought her, as if invisible hands were trying to keep it in place, but she refused to let go. She hurled the radio away from her, watching as it flew through the air in a blur of static, crashing against the trunk of a nearby tree. For a split second, there was silence, a deathly quiet that seemed to stretch on for eternity. Then came the scream. It was sharp and guttural, unlike anything Lena had ever heard. The radio shattered into 1,000 pieces, but the scream didn't stop. It filled the air, a chorus of tortured souls, their agony unmistakable. The voices were no longer whispering. They were screaming in a rage that felt like it was tearing at her insides. Lena staggered back, her eyes wide with horror. The air seemed to tremble with each shriek, the ground beneath her feet beginning to quake. And then the forest began to change. The trees twisted and groaned, their bark cracking open like rotting flesh. The leaves fell in slow motion, drifting downward like ash. The woods themselves seemed to be alive, responding to the sound of the radio's destruction. The very ground beneath her seemed to pulse, as if it were breathing, pulling the earth upward in jagged ridges. The world was warping around her, distorting. The figure in the distance, the one that had first appeared at the edge of the trees, now moved. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had form, and it was close. Lena's pulse raced as her eyes locked onto it. It wasn't alone. Behind it, a procession of dark, shifting shapes, twisted and hunched, emerged from the dark corners of the forest, their bodies bending at impossible angles, their limbs elongated and covered in shadows that stretched like ink across the night. They were coming. The first figure reached out with a skeletal hand, its fingers far too long, extending toward Lena. She could feel its presence now, touching her mind, pulling her thoughts in strange, disjointed directions. Her body froze. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was as if her very essence was being pulled into the shadows. The ground beneath her feet seemed to vibrate with the weight of something ancient, something dark. She could feel the pull of it, its hunger, its need. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. A voice, this time, a voice she had heard before, though she couldn't place it, cut through the oppressive silence. This one not from the radio, but from the dark itself. The figure's mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, like the gnashing of rocks. "You are the signal now, Lena," it hissed, the words dripping with malice. "You have awakened us. You have called us." It didn't matter that she couldn't move. It didn't matter that she couldn't speak. They could hear her thoughts. They could hear her fears. Lena's mind exploded with a sharp image. Jack's face, twisted and empty. His eyes, those eyes, had been hollow, lifeless. But now they were still staring at her. His mouth moved, forming words, but they were distorted, as though they were filtered through the very static of the radio. "You shouldn't have come." The image in her mind shifted, Jack's face fading into the static, replaced by the terrible, gnashing figures emerging from the trees. The world tilted again. It wasn't just the forest now. It was the very fabric of reality, warping, unraveling. The air itself felt wrong. "They're not real," Lena whispered, but the words tasted like ash in her mouth. She tried to push away the thought, but it clung to her like a nightmare she couldn't escape. "They're just in my head." But the trees, the voices, the figures, they were real. They were more real than anything she'd ever known. Lena shook her head violently, trying to snap herself out of the terror creeping in from all sides. There had to be a way out. There had to be something. But the figure in front of her smiled, its teeth impossibly sharp, and spoke again, its voice thick with darkness. "We are not the ones you should fear. The world around Lena shuddered violently, as though the very atmosphere was breaking apart. For a split second, everything froze. The trees, the shadows, even the horrific creatures seemed to pause. Then the ground beneath her feet cracked open. She fell. A deep, sucking pit opened beneath her, and before she could react, Lena plunged into the darkness below. It wasn't a fall, it was a descent. The walls of the pit seemed to close in, the shadows pressing against her from all sides, and the whispers, the voices grew louder. The temperature dropped, her breath turning into clouds of mist in the suffocating cold. The darkness stretched on, endless, an oppressive void that swallowed her whole. She felt the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on her, thick as concrete, as if the very air itself was designed to crush her soul. In that moment, Lena realized with sickening clarity that this wasn't just a nightmare. It was where they lived, and she was one of them now. The descent seemed endless. Lena's heart thudded against her ribs, each beat heavy, as if it were fighting to break free from her chest. The air around her was thick with cold, almost suffocating. She couldn't see, couldn't tell where the ground was, or if it even existed. It felt like the pit was pulling her deeper into the bowels of the earth, and each breath she drew came in shorter, sharper gasps, her lungs aching with the pressure. Her mind scrambled for some sense of reality, but it slipped further away with every passing second. Where was she? What was happening? Was this a dream? Was she still in the woods, or had she crossed into something else? There were no answers. The darkness wrapped itself around her, a physical thing, its tendrils tightening with each breath. The whispers, the voices grew louder. They weren't just in her head anymore. They were in the very air, in the space around her, like millions of fingers scratching at her consciousness. "You can't escape," they hissed. "We are everywhere." A cold, clammy sensation crawled up her spine. The static that had once been confined to the radio seemed to hum around her now, its crackling tone vibrating through her entire body, the energy making her skin prickle and her teeth ache. The darkness was alive. It pulsed with its own rhythm, with an unnatural heartbeat, as though the very void was feeding off her fear. She closed her eyes against the suffocating pressure, but that only seemed to make the voices louder. Their whispers, now a twisted, broken chant, began to make sense. "Lena." The voice was unmistakable. It was Jack's voice. But it wasn't Jack. It couldn't be. The same voice she had heard from him, empty, hollow, mechanical, reached her, though she couldn't place where it was coming from. It filled the void around her, and with it came the oppressive sense that she was no longer alone. That thing, those things were with her, watching. "Lena, you should have listened. You should have stayed away." It wasn't just Jack anymore. There were more voices, layered over his, blending into one massive wall of noise. The whispers were getting closer, circling around her like vultures. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the void, lost to the unbearable hum of the static. "You cannot run. You cannot hide. You are ours." The walls of the pit began to close in. Her head spun, dizziness threatening to overtake her. The weight of the air pressed harder, crushing down on her lungs, squeezing the very life out of her. She felt herself falling faster, spinning out of control. Her fingers scraped against the walls, but they were too smooth, too solid. There was no escape. Suddenly, the fall stopped. Everything paused. Lena hung suspended in the dark, her limbs frozen in midair as if she had hit an invisible surface. Her breath, ragged and shallow, was the only sound that remained in the eerie stillness. She could feel the presence of something vast surrounding her, the air pressing against her skin, almost suffocating her. Then, through the darkness, a light flickered on in the distance, a tiny pinprick of brightness. But it didn't feel like salvation. The static was back, but this time it wasn't just noise. It was a presence, something ancient and old that seemed to be waiting. The buzzing sound grew louder, sharp and painful, until it felt like it was rattling her bones. With a force she couldn't explain, the light began to grow, expanding, filling the void. It was not a light of warmth. It wasn't a soft, comforting glow. It was a harsh, white light, sharp and cold. And it was coming for her. Lena squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the worst. The light swirled around her, an unholy thing that felt like it was searing her very soul. Her skin burned, as though she was being consumed by the light itself, and her mind screamed. Her thoughts were being pulled apart, scattered across the black abyss, helplessly drifting toward that terrifying light. It was almost as if the light was alive, and it was hungry. Her body began to jerk as the light coiled around her, tightening like a vice. Her muscles were no longer her own. She was being forced toward it, pulled by the unseen tendrils of this thing that wasn't just light. It was something far more sinister. "You shouldn't have listened to the radio." The voice spoke again. This time it wasn't just an echo, it was in her head, loud and clear. And now it wasn't just Jack's voice. It was 1,000 voices, layered together, all speaking at once. They were the ones she had heard in the radio, the ones from the beginning. The voices were no longer whispers. They were clear, direct, commanding. "You are one of us now, Lena." With the force of the words, the light ripped through the darkness. She could feel the very fabric of her being stretched, torn at the edges, as though the light was peeling her apart. Her body fought against it, her arms and legs straining. But it was useless. There was no escaping, no fighting. Lena's heart slammed in her chest. Her mind screamed, "No, this can't be real. This can't be happening." But it was happening. The light swallowed her whole. When Lena opened her eyes again, it was no longer the dark pit that surrounded her. Instead, she was somewhere else. The air was thick, damp, but the suffocating weight of the dark was gone, replaced by a stifling pressure that seemed to pulse with the very essence of the place. It was the forest, but it was wrong. The trees were twisted, their bark darkened as if burned by fire. The leaves were sickly, withered and pale, and the ground was soft and spongy, as though the earth itself was rotting. The sky was black, filled with swirling clouds that churned like an impending storm. There was no moon, only a bleak, unnatural light cast everything in strange, pale hues. Lena was no longer alone. Figures surrounded her. Not shadows this time, but things. Distorted, grotesque, towering creatures with hollow faces and twisted bodies. They moved like smoke, flowing in and out of each other, a grotesque dance of shapes and shadows. Some of them were familiar. Their features, Jack's eyes, her mother's face, Evan's twisted grin, flickered in and out of view like broken images on a malfunctioning screen. They stared at her with cold, empty eyes. Lena's breath caught in her throat. The air was thick with a sense of despair. The presence of these creatures, these things, was overwhelming. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. It was as if they were inside her mind, filling every corner, suffocating her, controlling her. And then, from the middle of the forest, there came a sound. It was a low hum at first, just like the radio static. But this time it was different. It wasn't static anymore. It was a song, a twisted melody, one that resonated deep within her chest. The creatures around her began to sway, as though the melody had a power over them, bending them to its will. Lena's limbs felt heavy, her mind muddled. She felt herself walking, moving forward, as if the song was pulling her along. And as she walked, the air seemed to crack with the power of it. The song wasn't just a melody. It was a force, a call, a summons. It was calling her home. Lena's mouth went dry. She couldn't think, couldn't understand what was happening to her. All she could do was listen. The song grew louder, reverberating through Lena's bones, and she could feel it inside her now. It wasn't just a melody anymore. It was an infection, a pulse that beat in rhythm with her own heart. The forest around her seemed to warp, its trees twisting and shuddering in time with the eerie tune. Lena's legs moved forward as though guided by invisible strings. The world was dizzying, the ground soft and sinking beneath her feet, as if it were a dream, a nightmare that had trapped her in its grasp. The creatures watched her, their eyes unblinking, their hollow faces blank, yet full of a strange anticipation. She felt her chest tighten, a cold weight pressing down on her heart. The forest felt suffocating now. Each breath she took was heavier than the last, as if the air itself was thick with something terrible, something hungry. And then she saw it. In the center of the clearing, bathed in that cold, unnatural light, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and clothed in a cloak of shifting shadows. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but its eyes, they were bright, glowing, burning with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. The song grew louder, sharper, the air vibrating with its energy. And the figure, this thing, began to move, slowly, deliberately. It stepped forward, its presence commanding the very air to part. It raised a hand, beckoning Lena toward it. No! Lena's mind screamed the word, but her body continued moving. She couldn't stop. She wanted to run, to scream, but her limbs refused to obey her. The weight of her own body felt foreign, as though it didn't belong to her anymore. The more she struggled, the more the song twisted inside her, burrowing deeper into her consciousness, drowning out every thought, every instinct. The figure's voice, a low, reverberating hum, spoke not with sound, but with the song itself. The words slid into her mind, indistinguishable from the music, as if they had always been there. You should have known, Lena. Its voice was distant, yet all around her at once, like it was woven into the very fabric of the air. You've always known. Lena tried to speak, but no words came. She couldn't form a single coherent thought. The figure moved closer, its presence suffocating. And when it spoke again, its voice was colder, deeper, full of ancient knowledge. We are the signal, the static, the song. And you, it paused as though savoring the moment. You are part of it now. Lena felt the ground beneath her give way. Her body collapsed onto her knees. Her soul felt heavy, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her chest, pulling her further into the abyss. She reached out, her hands shaking. The creatures closed in, their eyes glowing, their faces contorted with pleasure, their bodies flowing around her, a mass of writhing shadows. No, Lena whispered, her voice barely audible, a desperate plea. The figure leaned down toward her, its hooded face inches from hers. It didn't need to speak aloud to be heard. The song, the hum, answered for it. She was no longer Lena. She was one of them. The world around her twisted, her vision blurred, then sharpened. She was no longer in the forest. She was everywhere and nowhere, all at once. The static, the hum, the song, it consumed her, wrapping around her mind, her body, until there was nothing left. Lena's thoughts faded. Her memories, her fears, her hopes, all became the song, a wave of sound that stretched out through the fabric of the universe. She could feel herself, her identity, dissolving into it. She was the signal. She was the frequency. She was the endless hum of the void. And she was always watching,